All right, good morning, everybody. It's exciting to see a lot of familiar faces. Last CannMed was here at the conference center. World was a very different place back then, so glad we can get everyone together. Really exciting stuff. So we're going to be talking today about a large study that we conducted on CBD. But before we dive in, just to give you guys some background on the approach that we took and who we actually are. So, our mission as a company here at Radicle Science was really to democratize access to clinical trials. My background, I started and ran UCLA's cannabis research program for a number of years from 2017 to 2020. And you would not believe how ridiculously so inexpensive it was for us to run clinical trials. There was just the general bureaucracy of any university, but because we received federal funding, there were very strict requirements that we had to follow that were not law, but there were requirements if you took federal funding. And so I left in the middle of the pandemic to start Radicle Science to be able to offer trials to non-prescription health products, starting with cannabinoids. And so we believe with data and with trials, you're converting these natural health products into precision medicines. And these precision medicines are democratized, right? They're always accessible. People can always get them. You don't have to go through a healthcare system or a doctor to get a hold on these products. That's what really drives us at Radicle Science. Michelle from my team is here. So it's exciting. A little bit of context, I talked about myself. Some of you might be familiar with my co-founder, Paylene Thorogood. So she's a technology entrepreneur, executive, and for the last 5 years, her foundation, the Holistic Foundation, has been the largest single funder of cannabinoid research in American history. About $6 million of research they've deployed to places like UC San Diego, University of Utah, Columbia University, UC Irvine, et cetera. So that's how we met a number of years ago. So it was really her coming from a big data, technology, philanthropy angle, me coming from my background in medicine and running clinical trials, and we realized that the academic model had a lot of shortcomings and that there was a lot that we could do in the private sector with Radicle Science to serve brands, to help them get the data they needed to make better products, to make claims, to grow their business. There's a flood of people. Welcome. They must have been holding the doors. You guys were in line to get in, lined up half an hour in advance. Thank you. Okay, so how do we achieve these efficiencies at Radicle Science? This will make sense when I start talking about our ACES data. How is it that we pulled off a 3,000 person trial? Well, the first thing is we go completely virtual. What is it? And it makes sense that we started this company during COVID. So, what happens when you eliminate all the physical infrastructure of a university, all the infrastructure of hospitals and clinics, all of the nursing staff, the research coordinators, the doctors, all these people that drive up the cost and complexity? What if you go completely virtual? And then what if you go completely direct to consumer? In this case, Radicle Science, we are the ones directly communicating with a consumer to recruit them into the study. We're the ones directly shipping them product. We're the ones directly collecting data from them. And then at the end of the study, we do something special. We analyze all their data, and every participant in our study actually gets a health report back that tracks their usage, their outcomes, and gives them a sense of how they experienced the product. We actually don't pay any participants in our studies, which is very unlike traditional clinical research. The third thing is because of these two features, we can go large scale. And as soon as you go large scale, the power of your study increases, the confidence in your results increase, and furthermore, you can now start getting at that precision medicine angle. You need large amounts of data to know that people of this type of ethnicity, this type of gender, respond in this manner. You can only get there with large amounts of data. And the last thing is this intentional heterogeneity. For pretty much the advent of trials, they were intentionally homogeneous. Because the sample sizes were small, you had to make all the participants look the same, or else there'd be too much noise in the data. Well, because we went large, we can have noise in the data and still make conclusions. So we have this intentional heterogeneity. People from different geographies, people of different demographics, different lifestyles, different pre-existing health conditions. All right, so what was Radicle ACES all about? ACES stands for Advancing CBD Education and Science, and I think it was actually Michelle from my team who helped us come up with that acronym. And I know a lot of you are familiar with this, but just to give you some brief background on why we thought it was important for us to run this ACES study. So it's very difficult, even to this day, for universities to study CBD. Here's why. 2018 Farm Bill, CBD no longer a controlled substance. However, that same year, Epidiolex was approved. And there's actually a law from the FDA, whereas if you have a naturally occurring product and someone turns it into a drug, and it wasn't yet sold as a supplement, it basically is banned forever as a supplement. However, if it was already being sold as a supplement and someone turns it into a drug, both are allowed to coexist. And in the case of CBD, the FDA is saying, this pharma company began their clinical trials much earlier than 2014, and no one really has presented evidence that CBD was sold widely as a supplement prior to that. So the FDA keeps saying, drug preclusion, drug preclusion. You look up any of the warning letters, they're saying CBD is a drug, it can't be sold as a supplement. And so what happens is when you're now a university, you can't study CBD unless you study it under an investigational new drug framework, which is dramatically more expensive, complex, and the brand that wants to give you their product to study has to now basically treat their product as a drug. It has to be manufactured a certain way, it needs a certain amount of regulatory filings. It's basically a non-starter for vast majority of brands. So that's why universities, including while I was at UCLA, we could not run a single study on any commercially available CBD product. It's very frustrating. So that's the context. Thousands of products being sold to tens of millions of Americans. Universities can't really study any of these commercially available products. So when we came onto the scene with ACES, our company was brand new. We had a small skeleton crew of employees, and we said, hey, let's just go run the largest clinical trial in CBD ever done in history. It'll be fine. We'll do it. We'll get it done. Here's the research team. So you'll notice some of these names on here. Ethan Russo, one of our co-authors and collaborators here in the audience as well. But it was a wide variety of people, our internal scientists, as well as a variety of our collaborators from academia. You might actually recognize some of these names on here. All right, so what did we do? So this was a 4-week open label study. Open label meaning the participants knew what they were getting. And in this case, our goal with this study was actually to generate what I often refer to as real-world evidence of outcomes. Because when someone walks into a grocery store, picks up a bottle of CBD, they know that it's CBD, and they're going to use it in a certain way. So our intention with this study was to try to capture and mimic what's happening when people are buying a CBD product. They're not blinded to it. They know what it is. So we kept it open label. But what we did was we randomized people to receive different CBD products, as well as to serve as a control arm in this study. And so we recruited about 3,000 people. To get into this study, you had to have at least one symptom of sleep disturbance, pain, or anxiety. So you had to have something in those 3 categories that you wanted to correct. And our main thing to look at was we were actually interested in a holistic outcome measure. We wanted to look at people's well-being, because well-being is often that manifestation of a bunch of different underlying changes in your life. And then the secondary outcomes was we also wanted to look at specifically your pain, your sleep, your anxiety, how did that change as well. And yes, this was by well over an order of magnitude the largest randomized clinical trial in CBD ever conducted. So here were the key health outcome measures we used. We used validated health outcome measures. So it wasn't just on a scale of 1 to 5, like how's your anxiety doing today? We use these validated outcome measures. So these have been run and developed by academia. They've been used in many other clinical trials. And when they're validated, you now know that when a score, say the PROMIS sleep quality score, when that moves a certain amount, you know if that's a clinically meaningful difference. And now that kind of serves as a benchmark where you can go look at other interventions done in other studies, and you see, that intervention changed that validated outcome measure this much. And in our study, it changes this much. And now that gives you a way to kind of compare across studies. So it's important to use these outcome measures. We also looked at side effects. One thing I want to briefly mention is the timeline. So from when we came up with the idea to when we completed the study was like about 9 months. And this is a type of trial that could have easily taken 5 to plus years to conduct and publish in other settings. So we were pretty proud of that. And again, our company was a couple months old when we came up with this idea. I think we had 4 employees, so things were a little crazy. All right, so here were the brands that participated. These were the sponsors of ACES. Some of the brands I think are actually exhibiting here. I've seen the Teeler team walking around. But these are the brands that participated. You'll notice different form factors. So we wanted a variety of different products because the thousands of CBD products that any American can buy, they come in all shapes and sizes and formulations and dosages and form factors. So this was, again, real-world evidence that we were trying to capture. Again, form factor-wise, there were fast melt tablets, capsules, tinctures, soft gels, gummies, oral sprays. There was also different dosages across the board, as well as spectrum. Some of these products were full, some were broad, some were isolate. So that was another one of our hypotheses. How is spectrum going to impact the outcome measures? All right, speaking of demographics, again, we wanted intentional heterogeneity. And if you look at clinical studies historically, women have largely been excluded and underrepresented in trials. For various reasons I'm not going to get into today, but you can look up as to reasons why. So in our study, we're like, let's try to get equal representation of women. So when we went out to recruit, we leaned heavily on recruitment channels that we knew would hit women. And we were actually too successful because like 90% of the study turned out to be women. So we succeeded, but not in the way that we thought we would. Now, to be fair, your average CBD user tends to skew female, and women tend to be the purchasers of health and wellness products for the household. But it still doesn't explain this full 90%. Our studies that we're running now, we've gotten back to 50-50 gender balance. But in this study, it definitely was skewed female. But we are proud that we got people across all 50 US states, which never happens in a clinical trial. For a site-based trial at a university, every single person in that study comes from a 10-mile driving radius of your university. So you're not hitting people that come from diverse socioeconomic background, diverse environmental exposures, lifestyle, cultural factors. All these things can impact our health. And then we had good race and ethnic diversity as well. Very briefly, what were we analyzing? So we were using this linear mixed model approach. It's kind of the gold standard for analyzing this type of data from a biostatistical standpoint. And we did a couple comparisons. So what we did was we took every single product in the study and we compared it to the control group. Then we analyzed if we clustered the products by, say, their spectrum, broad, full, isolate, by their dosage, how did those clusters compare to one another? And then we looked at the characteristics of people in the study, gender, CBD use, and age. And were those predictive of whether you would have a better or worse outcome? Again, this is about precision medicine. The right person, the right dosage, the right product for the right condition. That's what we're trying to get at. So here are the outcome measures we looked at across the board. So you'll look at the highlighted line is the control group. So this group was recruited in the study, and they agreed to fill out surveys, but they did not receive any product. And the reason you use a control group like this is if something happens in the macro environment and you see the control group's anxiety spike or maybe get a lot better, say it spikes when the war in Ukraine happens, anxiety might fall when the COVID vaccine comes out. That's important to know because the people that might be getting CBD, if you see their anxiety spike or their anxiety decline, you need to make sure that it's not due to a macro factor. So you compare them to the control group. So in this case, well-being increased dramatically across the board. It was quite statistically significant across, this is where we aggregated the data from all the products. Anxiety plummeted, and it was quite significant as well. That's the chart on your right. And then if we look at sleep, sleep disturbance, aka dropping is good. So there was less sleep disturbance in the people receiving product, as well as pain decreased as well. And notice in all these charts, there's a very rapid drop in the first week to 10 days, and then it continues to improve, but at a much slower ramp. So we saw across the board that these health outcomes, most of the improvements were seen in the first week, and then had a little gradual improvement to the end of the 4-week study. So to recap, what we just saw in those charts, the most beneficial effect we saw was actually for anxiety. So 63% of people had a clinically meaningful improvement in their anxiety, followed by sleep. 61% of people had a clinically meaningful improvement, and then pain it still improved, but compared to sleep and anxiety had less improvement. About less than half of people had a meaningful improvement in their pain. And clinically meaningful, when you use these validated outcome measures, is scientifically defined. It means a significant, palpable change that would affect their quality of life. So basically we're seeing people are indeed getting better across all these domains, including their well-being, that holistic measure of their health as well. Now, we found no differences when we clustered people by age or by gender or by prior CBD use. So none of those variables were predictive if someone was going to have a better or worse outcome from CBD. So that was an interesting finding from the study. And also because, I don't think there was a talk here today, but you do find in mouse studies that there are sex differences when it comes to cannabinoids. Most of that study has been on THC specifically, but there is this theoretical sex difference that could occur. Side effects were pretty mild across the board. About 10% of people had a side effect, and pretty much all side effects were mild. Most common ones were digestive in nature, gas, flatulence, and diarrhea, bloating, which is in line with what you see in the clinical trials of CBD, say on Epidiolex. You had the most common side effects were often related to digestive issues. All right, so a couple caveats here. First thing, this is an open label trial, so you can't disentangle the placebo effect here. A lot of the studies we're running now are blinded and placebo controlled, so in those instances you can disentangle the placebo effect, and so the studies that we're running for brands right now are intended to show that their product is indeed better than placebo and kind of make these strong claims. Another caveat here is, again, we had over 90% of the participants were female. Potentially that's skewing the data. It would have been nice to have more male representation in the study. And here's the other thing. Before I show you the next slide, keep in mind that, yes, we grouped all these products by dosage, and then we tried to see if there were any differences in outcomes. But just because you grouped all these products by dosage, like lower dose products, moderate, and high dose, the products still differed in other attributes. The form factor was different. The spectrum was different. So you had multiple criteria that were different between products. So even when we held and compared one criteria at a time, just because, for example, the spectrum of the product didn't seem to make a difference, it doesn't mean, in this study, it's hard to actually conclude that the entourage effect doesn't work and that spectrum doesn't work, right? And it's because when you, again, group all the products by, say, full spectrum, broad, and isolate, and you see that there's no major differences across the board when you group them that way, these products are still quite different in dose and form factor. So maybe the full spectrum product did indeed work better, but that product was a lower dose. And so that's why you don't see a difference when you compare it to a higher dosed isolate in aggregate. And so here were the final findings. So again, all the products across the group, improvements in well-being, pain, sleep, anxiety, pretty rare and mild side effects. There were no characteristics in the participants that we could find that could predict whether they were more or less likely to benefit. We did not find any differences when we grouped the products by spectrum. So the full spectrum products we studied did not outperform the broad, did not outperform the isolate, and none were better or worse in aggregate. So that was an interesting finding from this. One thing we did find is that dose was not king. And in fact, there were products that had lower doses of CBD that were often outperforming products with higher doses of CBD. And the way we had to run this study was we had to anonymize and aggregate all the data, so we're not allowed to actually tell you which specific brands were outperforming other ones. But what we can tell you is that The lower dose products, some of them were beating the higher dose products. And maybe it's because their formulation allowed for better absorption. Maybe it was because the spectrum that they had was able to counteract the fact that they had a lower dose, for example. So again, one thing you commonly hear from scientists is I forget who said this and I'm totally stealing it, but it's like every great study warrants like 4 more. So this was our first shot across the bow. We've since followed up this study with trials encompassing another probably 10,000 people studying minor cannabinoids, CBD products, et cetera. So we hope that there's just more and more science and research that can come out from here. So with that, I believe we have time. We have some time for questions. So don't leave me hanging. Who's got questions? Or maybe my presentation was that good. You're stunned to silence.
That was excellent talk. I was curious, so you're doing everything virtually here. How do you keep from biasing your sample size of folks who can only get on virtually, for example?
Sure. So to participate in the study, we didn't even want to force people to download an app. I don't know if you've ever had a parent call you trying to figure out their it's Apple Store login and stuff. So everyone could participate as long as they basically had internet, and they didn't even need a phone. You could participate via text message, you could participate via email, and the email you're checking from your phone or your laptop. So as long as you had internet and some device that could get some communication, you can participate. Typically what you see in clinical trials is that rural populations are not represented. 20% of our participants came from rural populations, which is really impressive. And so I think from that diversity standpoint, anyone that wanted to join could pretty much participate. And in terms of the bias question here, the way that again, because it was an open label study, you can't take out the placebo effect, but because we randomized people to the different products, any confounding variables are kind of spread evenly across the 13 products and brands. Therefore, if any brands did have superior outcomes, you can say that both those products had similar participants randomized to them, and any differences you see is not because these participants also took supplements or drugs, because that should have been equal between all the products.
Jeff, thank you for your talk and the work that you're doing. You showed in one slide that there was a significant, some efficacy in the beginning for the first week. Was the dosing protocol the same throughout the entire study, or did you adjust the dosing suggestion in certain?
It was consistent across the whole study. So for all the health outcome measures we saw, most of the improvements happened in the first week. The participants were actually instructed to use the products as the products were labeled and suggested the usage. So effectively, we were letting the brands drive the recommended usage by following the instructions of the products. Again, this study was all about real-world data. So all the participants were instructed to look at the suggested servings and usage of the product and use it accordingly. And again, across the board, we saw that all the improvements, or most of the improvements, were happening in that first week. And then again, a little bit of improvement that continued all the way to the tail end of the 30 days.
Thank you very much for your study. I think that we do need a lot more real-world evidence, so thank you again. First question is, what is your intent? Is there any intent to look at the formulations, the difference between the olive oils, the MCT oils, things like that, shelf stabilities? And if you can, what's the future of, you just brought up a very good point, this one study is going to bring up 4 more studies. So what is the future for Radicle and your group, sir?
Yeah, it's a great question. We thought about trying to analyze the data based on the formulations. Some products were using olive oil, some were using MCT oils, some were, they weren't oil-based, right? They were sitting in a gummy matrix, things like that. And there was just too many different carrier matrices and oils. It wouldn't have been a useful cluster. And so that's not necessarily something that we can address with this one study. But going forward, what we're running studies on is, we're adding in blinding, we're adding in additional control measures. And the brands that are coming to us, sometimes they're doing their own, they have their own hypotheses. So for instance, there are brands coming to us and they'll hand us 6 different products. And it's the same cannabinoids and it's the same dose, but they're using 6 different carrier oils. And they want to figure out which one works the best, if at all. And so those are the studies we're running now. And because we're blinding participants to them, then we're really factoring out any sort of bias. So those are the studies we're running now to answer some of those questions. But it's being driven by the brands. So we're really here to be their kind of, to carry out what their goals are. Is it an R&D goal? Is it a claim goal? So yeah, great question. And I think, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. First, you've just turned clinical research on its head. Congratulations. Secondly, excellent vision and great work. My question is, how many of the products had little to no effect?
Well, so this was an open, every single product had a quite significant improvement. All 13 products across the board. So both in aggregate, they all did really well, and then individually, there wasn't a single product that did not create significant improvements across the board. But again, it's an open label study. So, and if you look at, people's belief in CBD, it's high right now. So again, we can't disentangle how much of that improvement was 10% of that improvement driven by the placebo effect? Was it 20? Was it 30%? We don't know. But there's a series of blinded randomized trials that we're running right now. Actually, they're already finished. We're just analyzing the data. So those are pretty much the first blinded placebo-controlled trials on CBD testing the dosage ranges that consumers are using, which is well under 100 milligrams, and testing it for some of these common conditions. So it's exciting. I can't wait. Like literally every day my team's like, is the data ready to look at yet? Like what's going on? So. We did not see any loss of effect. And this was a relatively, 30 days is still decent. It's not a 1-week study, it's 30 days. We've run 60-day studies in the past, and we've seen that the effect is actually sustained all the way up to 60 days. We've not run studies beyond 60 days. So, yeah.
Thanks, wonderful talk. My question is a 2-part. One is just general understanding of the nomenclature, and 2 is logistics. So when I think full spectrum, I'm thinking maybe there's a little bit of THC in some of these products. And how do you go about distributing products that contain amounts of THC to all 50 states?
And this is where it's about risk tolerance. So again, if in this case, our interpretation of the 2018 Farm Bill is that you can have permissible amounts of THC. So in this case, all the THC content was quite low, well below 0.3%. And so in that instance, our rationale as researchers was these products are already being sold, consumers are already buying them, so us as researchers should be allowed to take possession and ship them across state lines. So that's not a risk that a university would be willing to take, but it's nice when you don't take federal funding. So, yeah.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Hi, awesome, love. And the question is, I'm kind of a one-note song, like most people know. Are you doing any trials for people living with dementia or Alzheimer's?
So the one restriction on how we conduct our research is we can't study diseases without triggering an IND. And as soon as we trigger an IND, it means that the brands that want us to do studies for them, they're subject to an IND as well, which means they now have to file a ton of and now imagine a CBD company trying to file an IND with the FDA. It's a non-starter. So we have to be very clever with how we study conditions without actually studying diseases. So the short answer is no, we haven't necessarily been studying these products on people with dementia, but what I would do is I would do a big recruitment for anyone who believes they're suffering from poor memory.
Cool.
Regardless of how you've been diagnosed. And I would get all those people into the study.
Cool.
And then after that fact, some subset of them may or may not have certain diseases, but I didn't recruit for that disease.
Awesome.
I'm not subject to an IND.
Super clever.
So yeah,
Very
we've yet to
good.
attempt that. That's theoretically, we want to try that, yeah. Of course.
Thank you for sharing this information. I was curious if you'd had any follow-up with the participants after the study concluded, and if they continued using the products or if they continued seeing benefits after they stopped using products.
Yeah, so you brought up a great question. just this week, our research team was like, you know what, we should probably check in with the participants and just maybe try to collect a little more information now that they're 6 months in. What I will say is a majority of participants in the study are opting in, wanting to continue to use the product and wanting the brands to reach out and contact them. A significant majority. So they seem to be pretty happy with the process. But it's a great point. We probably should start following up now that more time has elapsed to see like what's going on.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Valentia, and I have a high-end dispensary located in Carmel, California. I've been in the medical space since, well, over a decade. I'm going on my
Wow,
12th
all right.
year. So, of course, when we first started in 2008, when I had the first nonprofit on the Central Coast, we did see sleep and pain being number one. Since pandemic, we've seen, of course, anxiety be number one. Dr. Meshulam taught me 2.5 years ago when I met with him that anywhere between 20 and 30 milligrams of CBD full spectrum will help not only with my MS, which I've had for 30 years. I used to be in a wheelchair. But I'm confused because when I look at your study, I see a lot of hemp product in there. We were told, or am I hearing you say, let me ask the question, that the hemp line's part of the study the same as a THC line?
Great. So first off, all of these products had were hemp products, and the ones that did have THC had tiny amounts of THC. And at least in our analysis, when we compared all the products that were full spectrum, aka had some amount of THC, with the broad and the isolate, we did not see significant differences in their outcomes. But they didn't just differ in spectrum, they differed in dose and form factor. So it could have been that the spectrums were outperforming, but they were lower dosed, and that's why they were able to match. So that we weren't able to, this study wasn't designed to be able to address that particular issue. But yeah, in this case, very low amounts of THC, like pretty tiny amounts, yet people were seeing these significant outcomes.
That probably explains why they weren't being effective for sleep. You need some THC for sleep and for pain.
Potentially. I mean, in this case, you know, anxiety was the best performing outcome, followed by sleep, followed by pain. And I think there's just not enough research. So, I mean, clearly there is clinical trial data that THC helps with pain, that THC helps with sleep.
So with
and
him,
that data doesn't exist yet for CBD.
excuse me, with him then taking such a priority in this role, where does it leave those of us that are licensed, that have spent a decade and millions of dollars getting licensed in the cannabis space in terms of, I'm the only one in the entirety of California that has a pharmacist and nurses together. My question then, where does this study, thank you, and a female. And so where does this study leave our patient community other than more confused?
Well, here's the thing. I mean, there are many people who can't access THC, and the best thing they could get right now is a CBD product that they trust and maybe buy online or buy in a store. For folks who do have access to THC, I think they should, you know, try it. And they might find that one works better than another. Clearly, there is more clinical data, rigorous randomized controlled trial, blinded data, that THC does indeed help with pain and can help with the onset of sleep, making you fall. Now, whether it gives you better sleep is a different question, but there's data that it shows it decreases sleep latency. That data does not exist for CBD. This data is some of the closest data we've gotten to actually what does CBD objectively do at these doses, well under 100 milligrams, for these conditions. So I think that the answer is if you can access THC, try it. If you have intolerable side effects, then maybe try a predominant CBD product. And if you're in a state that doesn't have access to the cannabis, then you might only have options such as CBD.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. All right, and last but not least.
All right, thank you very much. My question, so I believe what the results you showed us were comparing the mean scores on the various measures. Have you also looked at the
mean change? So we
change.
basically took every participant's baseline across the different health outcomes and tracked it each week. So we were assessing their severity of symptoms every week.
Okay, but you mentioned that not all the participants had a clinically significant improvement. Did you also look at the fraction of individuals who had that clinical improvement, and maybe that varied across the the participant categories?
It was a little muffled, but I think you were saying, did we look at, of those that didn't have a clinically meaningful improvement?
Well, it was just a response variable that was either yes, they had a clinical improvement, or no, they didn't.
Oh, I see. So we could have reported the data as what their score change percentage was, right? So on average, people's pain improved 30%, things like that. But in the world of medicine, these clinically meaningful cutoffs are more important. Because like, I'll give you an example, right? I have a new drug. It'll improve your pain by 20%. You're like, oh, 20%, that's pretty cool. But it actually doesn't really hit the cutoff for what is clinically meaningful. I think the cutoff's about 30%. And so what we went for in this study was to say, hey, if this were judged as a pharmaceutical drug, how would a doctor evaluate it? They would evaluate it based on the percentage of people using it that had a clinically meaningful difference in their pain or their sleep and their anxiety. Because if you just hear percentages, your anxiety is 10% better. You're like, oh, that's pretty cool. But does it warrant you paying money, potentially having side effects to try this new product? Right? So we basically converted the percentage changes and the mean score changes and saw how many of them hit that threshold for clinically meaningful. And that's how we got these numbers, right? 63% of people in the study had a clinically meaningful improvement in anxiety. If you had a pharma drug that could demonstrate that, that is going to do very well, and insurance companies would be happy to reimburse for it. But again, this was an open label study. So some amount of that 63% of people, some portion of that improvement was probably being driven by the placebo effect, right? Just like anything that you study in an open label study, whether it's a supplement or meditation or a pharma drug. So that's why there needs to be additional studies on here, and this was just our first shot across the bow. So we're excited. I mean, in this last 30 days alone, we've probably run trials on 6,000 people, blinded randomized trials on CBD, CBG, CBN, CBC. So we're exploring a bunch of different products, but there's literally there's like so much work to be done. So we need help. We need other researchers. We need other people picking up and running studies too. We can't do it alone. So, all right, well, thank you guys.